The presentation you are about to watch will discuss psychosis, including both audio and visual hallucinations, suicide, anxiety, depression, abuse, iatrogenic harm, and violence. It is written from a mad studies perspective and, as such, uses the term mad as a reclaimed term. It is not intended to be exclusionary, and you are very much encouraged to substitute your own terminology. To fully appreciate the technology used in this presentation, it is strongly recommended that you use headphones to view it.
Hello. Who are you? Doesn't matter. Welcome. You're safe with me. I'll be right here, nice and close so I can speak without alerting the others. Let me tell you about Senua. Now, her story has already come to an end, but now it begins anew.
What's happening? It's breathing. Dead. It's breathing. It's breathing. He knows she's getting closer. He can feel her coming closer. She's getting closer. They're watching. They're watching. They're watching. They're watching.
This is a journey deep into darkness.
They're watching.
There will be no more stories after this one.
What is she doing? Why is she doing this? They're watching. Why doesn't she turn coming? She's doing this for him. She wants to rescue him. He's already dead. I can feel you coming. Quiet.
Video games have come a long way in their depiction of madness, but there's still a very long way to go. Like many art forms, it has often relied on stereotypes of what a mad person looks like, and in doing so perpetuated them. Now, I'm not going to try to show you the entire history of that development. Instead, I'd like to talk to you about the methods used in developing a video game about madness, focusing especially on one key point. Were mad people involved in creating this video game? And what difference does that make? One of the biggest varying factors in the production of video games is, unsurprisingly, money. It is possible for a single person to produce a successful video game. This means it's very possible for one sole person to have control of producing every aspect of that game, from the story to the gameplay to the music that you hear. The game that you're watching right now, 1365, is one such game. It is made in what is called a game engine, which, put simply, means the creator did not have to code every aspect of this game manually. They were able to use the engine to generate environments, maps, levels, back-end systems, and even models like the characters you see here. This enables people who would not normally have the skills necessary to develop a video game to produce one. 1365 is a platformer game, meaning you go from left to right and jump around, where you travel through the halls of a high school attempting to survive. It was created by one young person to convey their experience of anxiety and depression. These games are often referred to as indie games, though in truth this covers a very wide range of games and a very wide range of funding. The game you're now watching, Never Ending Nightmares, was made by a small team and funded by a moderately successful Kickstarter. Like 1365, it is also a platformer game or side-scrolling game, but has the benefit of custom-drawn and highly impactful environments, rather than relying on the simplistic pixel art form that 1365 does. Although multiple people were involved in the creation of Never Ending Nightmares, and although it takes strong influence from the horror genre, which doesn't have the best track record with its representation of madness, it was still primarily created by someone with experience of OCD and depression. In fact, if we take a mad reading of this game, we can see this section, which takes place in an asylum, to be not simply a continuation of the horror tropes around institutionalization, but an illustration of the abuse, iatrogenic harm, and dehumanization of the mad that occurs within them, showing the horror that exists in reality. This divergence in reading video games about madness as good or bad, or accurate or inaccurate representation, is something that it is difficult but very important to keep hold of. In her book Black Madness, Mad Blackness, Terry Alice Pickens writes that she chooses to, quote, rest in the vagueness and insult mad brings, end quote. And it is this relationship to the malleability and vagueness of meaning and affect that, I think, can be lost when the mad are taken out of the creator's seat. To illustrate this, let's look at what it would be very tempting to call a bad example of madness in video games, one that was made without mad input and as a result is constructed heavily of stereotype and stigma.
Looks like Nathaniel Williams is a pretty religious guy.
He's a God-fearing idiot, waiting for the end of the world. We questioned him a few months back because he was causing a disturbance in the park. He was ranting and raving. Said he heard voices. Had this idea in his sick little head that I was the Antichrist. I'd come to Earth to persecute him. Real twisted.
In this scene, the player, controlling FBI agent Norman Jayden, is given the choice of whether to join in with the policeman in abusing Nathaniel or whether to try to intervene. His intervention is not guaranteed to succeed. There's a lot to say about this scene. It isn't unfair in its representation of police brutality, for a start. It's also true that many people who experience delusions find them to be religious in some form. In her memoir Inferno, Catherine Cho describes her postnatal psychosis as hell, purgatory, where she sees demons conversing with the nurses tending her. But in this scene, Nathaniel is not a person. He is a vehicle by which the player experiences Jayden's lack of power and the abusive police force. In this, we can see what Rhea Shane calls the crime genre's, quote, exploitation of disability's affective change, end quote. Nathaniel is here purely in service to Jayden's character development. He is not a person. He is not intended to be. This game, Heavy Rain, moves the player between controlling several different characters, all of whom overlap at points. Multiple characters that the player controls experience some kind of madness. Indeed, the entire game hinges around the question of whether one character's memory loss conceals a mass murdering spree. So, does Heavy Rain accord more personhood to these three playable characters? Sadly, it would seem not. This is Madison. Madison is the only female playable character in Heavy Rain, the only non-male, and fits into the noir genre's role of the femme fatale. However, as Jennifer Malkowski identifies in a study of this trope, Madison is ultimately failed by the narrative. In 5 of her 9 playable chapters, Madison is assaulted, 3 of these instances being either directly or explicitly sexual. Even when being held at gunpoint, Madison is shown in alluring cinematic angles. When using the game's mechanic to view the character's inner thoughts, Madison is shown as feeling vulnerable, afraid, and lacking control. It's important to clarify that the presence of fear is not what inherently weakens Madison as a character. Fear is an intrinsic part of the mad experience. But in conjunction with the rest of Madison's story of a repeated victim of assault, it renders Madison one-dimensional and undermines what power the female fatale possesses. Like Nathaniel, she ultimately ends up being a key to the development of other characters and the construction of the gritty setting, rather than as a person unto herself.
Would you like a drink? I was just about to have one.
The titular character of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is very different to Madison. You've seen Senua already at the start of this presentation, as we listen to the dialogue between the voices she hears, all of whom have distinct personalities and are heard not simply in stereo but with binaural audio. Recorded into what looks like a set of ears, this allows positionality to be baked into it. This technology is used throughout the game to pull the player into a first-person perspective, even as they are shown Senua in the third person. A deliberate decision that, the developers say, was intended to help you mirror the emotions you see her experiencing, whilst also experiencing her senses from her point of view. From the ground up, Senua's Sacrifice was made in conjunction with people with experience of psychosis. Although several video games in the past several years have started to involve experts, they are often academics or clinicians rather than the mad themselves. For example, the game Psychonauts and its sequel Psychonauts 2 consulted with mental health charity Take This to create their highly psychological platformer. Ninja Theory, the creators of Senua's Sacrifice, enlisted not only psychologists, but a group of service users from an NHS mental health service. These service users were quoted as saying that their efforts were anything but tokenistic, with major changes being made to the game based on their feedback and insight. I can't emphasise enough how unusual this is. I talked earlier about indie games being made with small teams and thus being easier to keep their own voice in sight. Ninja Theory is not a small company. It's large enough to be considered a AAA game producer, which is to say a top-end game, think Hollywood in terms of films, but small enough to keep that indie feel. And their methods of consultation, all of which were revealed in a series of developer diary videos by the company, are truly unique in the video games industry. Not to say that no one's ever done it, but it's never been this extensive, this public, this impactful on the game design. The service users encourage Ninja Theory to show not just the horror of psychosis but also the beauty, in vivid colours and the comfort of helpful voices. Throughout the game, Senua's voices provide not only jeering and insult but instruction, taking the place of a more traditional tutorial with their commentary. Although there's no such thing as perfect representation, and indeed the game has had some critique from the MAD with its representation of psychosis, especially around the interaction between Senua's psychosis and the fantastical, mythological setting. By and large, though, the game is held to be a very immersive method of conveying the experience of this particular kind of madness. Perhaps the most controversial part of Senua's Sacrifice was a decision made by the developers to break the fourth wall in an attempt to engender fear in the player. Let's look at that now in this clip that follows Senua's first combat. The player has just had an unwinnable fight, one that has ended with Senua collapsing to the ground in agony.
A vision of what's to come. Poor Senua. The darkness does not bargain. It does not reason. It is wrought. And now it has taken hold. It will spread towards her head, the seat of the soul, until there is nothing left of her. All of her suffering will have been for nothing. It's just a matter of time. battles are fought in the mind.
This intrusion of a much more traditional instruction, stating that the game will be over if the player dies too many times, is a lie. There is no mechanic that will cause the game to end should the rot reach Senua's head. This is something the developers chose to put in, with the hopes of making the player experience some of Senua's fear, to undo the comfort of knowing that you can save and reload by making that power finite. I don't personally think the game needed this, and it was not at all well received by players. It also becomes moot after the game's release because eventually it becomes common knowledge that this is a lie. It also completely intrudes on the immersion that they have otherwise fostered, with the absence of a traditional tutorial and the use of no heads-up display, i.e. no health bars or similar visible on the screen. I include this to return us to that idea of vagueness and malleability. Senua's Sacrifice is not perfect, but it is deeply interesting and innovative in its methods, something that, to me, makes it far more worthy of study than even its narrative or play experience. It is the first step on what could, if other studios follow suit, mark a huge transformation in madness in video games, and the key to it all was the presence of the mad. Nothing about us without us is a saying that came into use in 1990s disability activism. At its core, it means that no decisions should be made about disabled people without those disabled people being present and involved. The thing I love about the medical and health humanities is that ideas like this, born of activism and developed in scholarship, can not only be linked to the media we consume, but can be explored with all the wisdom and context of a myriad of disciplines. That video games, which mean so much to me but are so often seen as just a game, can be finally seen as a space where these ideas overlap and flourish and meet audiences that they wouldn't otherwise. Just like the disabled who stood up in the 90s and said, "Hey, we're here and we're already talking about this, already living this," I implore you to take these new approaches you've seen today not as sites of inquiry that have sprung up out of nowhere, but as medias with storied and insightful legacies that have not received the attention in the Academy that they deserve. Thank you very much for listening to me.